Welcome to the Human Flourishing Project. I'm your host, Alex Epstein. Today's episode is further insights on fasting and food frequency. And the genesis of this is that the man I have repeatedly called Ray Cronise, but I have recently learned is Cronise, just like people like to call me Epstein, but I'm Epstein. Ray Cronise reached out to me. If you remember, he is the main person who gave me guidance that encouraged me to fast, which I talked about 2 weeks ago. And he reached out with a whole bunch of insights, or at least the beginning of insights. And he said, "Hey, do you want to do a podcast? And I can share with you some of the insights or some insights that I have about fasting and food frequency that might help you." And Ray is a very successful and sought after nutrition coach, and I've found his perspective very useful. And you should, if you haven't heard the episode we did on health span, I'd recommend that. And then if you want some of the context for this episode, you can listen to the episode I did on fasting. But just in case you haven't, the basic idea I shared is that I talked to Ray about nutrition, and the number one action he gave me was to decrease my food frequency. And so I started using an app called Zero and just committing to having at least one 13-hour block every day where I'm not eating, which for most people might be trivial, but for me was a very, very big deal. And then on the fasting episode, I talked about the numerous benefits that have accrued from this. And Ray reached out and said that he could help me a bunch more, and by implication, help the listeners a bunch more. So I was excited to hear from him. And Ray, welcome back to the Human Flourishing Project.
Thanks, Alex.
All right. So we talked in advance, and you have something like half a dozen different insights. So I will just share with me insight number one, and I'm mostly going to be listening, but I'll interrupt if something's not clear to me.
Well, good. I hope to ask some questions too. So
okay. Well, I won't tune out. So I will be ready to answer whenever.
Great. So yeah. So as I was listening to that, the other podcast on fasting, a few things were coming to mind as you were talking, and I love the analytical approach you take to everything. I think we've both talked about that even when we got together out there in LA. It's really interesting that we both come from that sort of objectivist, see the world as it is, not how you want it to be. And, in that real world, just like Francisco Diaconia says, contradictions don't exist. When you find a contradiction, check your premises. One of them is typically wrong. And I think I've had a lot of wrong premises over the years. I've been wrong many times, and I find that as a sort of a reassurance that I'm not stuck in dogma. But, to set up this whole idea, fasting has become, in the last 3 or 4 years, fasting has become ubiquitous. Like you said, there's the apps for measuring the time.
And it has 700,000 people. What part of what's cool about it is it tells you how many other people are fasting. And, at a given time now, it's 700,000 people are using that app. So
it's crazy. Yeah. So, when I began this, my goal when I was doing more of my longer term fasts, so I've done many 3 to 5 day fasts. And then I did one that was 14 days, and it turned out I didn't see what I wanted to see. And so I went back and I did one that was 24 days. And these were all medically supervised. So I wasn't just, doing it in my closet or anything. And I was taking a lot of measurements, 24-hour urine collection, daily calorimetry, blood glucose monitor, continuous blood glucose monitor, over 80 biomarkers. So I was watching how my body adapted over time. And it's really interesting because it gives you some insight. A lot of times, what we have to go on is how we feel, right? I mean, when you were talking about some of your experiences, for example, when you started using the app and you increased it, I think it was like to 13 hours or something, you stopped in that evening, but then you ate again in the morning, and your friend or somebody made the laughing comment, well, yeah, great, you went overnight without food. But you wouldn't believe how common that is. So, when we deal with a lot of clients that are, these are specifically for weight loss, many of them have this illusion that they need to eat every couple of hours. In fact, that's how I really got started on this. I was doing Body for Life, if you remember that book
Sure.
when it came out, Bill Phillips, and I believed in this small frequent meal thing. It was there, and you can lose weight no matter what you're doing with the deficit. So But I don't want to focus today's conversation on weight loss per se. I'd rather focus on some of the things you were experiencing, and then, maybe set some new definitions and some new directions, and see, maybe we check back at some point and talk about how those went. But the overarching idea here is decreasing meal frequency. And when we decrease meal frequency, we're spending more time in the fasted state. Now, personally, I don't consider something a fast until it's beyond around 36 hours. So I don't call overnight, I don't call eating once a day intermittent fasting. I just think these are way too many syllables in terms of people trying to make something sound more technical than it is. And I think it also puts the emphasis on the wrong thing. Just like the eat meat, don't eat meat framework tends to put the focus on the wrong thing. So, I know we both believe a lot in these frameworks that we use to sort of assess the world. So, one of the things that I learned is that, if you think about biology, many things are socially extreme, but biologically normal. And I would say most human eating habits today are biologically extreme and socially normal, right? So, me not eating for 24 days is certainly socially extreme. But honestly, all of my biomarkers said I was fine. I was healthy at the end of that time. So it wasn't that I was putting myself in any jeopardy, and it's not something you want to do unsupervised. And it's mainly because, you have an increase, you're really low blood pressure, you have an increased chance of passing out. There are some other things that can go wrong with it. So I don't want people to do these long-term fasts, but I want you to know that many of the adaptations of times without food, the biological adaptations, and these are the ones that we talked on or touched on last time in terms of the things that activate the sirtuin genes and activate these longevity genes to preserve the organism for a better time to reproduce. That's a simple way to put it. Many of these mechanisms don't kick in till after, some period of days. So for example, I used the number 36 and hours in terms of what I call fasting. And the reason is by that time, no matter how glycogen replete you were to begin with, your liver stores glycogen and it balances your blood glucose. By 36 hours, it's gone. And so you're certainly in, of course, ketogenesis is another thing that's so fad right now and everybody's doing it. But I'm talking about the real ketogenesis, the one that has you survive when when your glucose supplies have gone away. Your blood glucose, by the way, never goes to zero, even in a 24-day fast. It's still fine. So glucose is that important. Everybody who thinks glucose is this, poisonous molecule, this is just a crazy new thought that's out there, and I'm sure it'll fade at some point. But my point here for you is that a lot of things that I heard, and I want to kind of get some feedback, but a lot of things I heard were in terms of you trying to reconstruct these habits that you had about when you ate. And so I wonder, as you were doing that, how much did that sort of mindset, we call it lizard brain when we're talking to our clients, where you just start thinking about it and you can't stop. How much does that drive when it's time to eat?
You mean now or before?
Anytime, just to describe the transformation, if there's a difference.
Well, I mentioned this on the podcast, but a big thing, hold on, I lost my train of thought. So it was this, this idea, I forget how I put it in the podcast, but you call it hunger is not an emergency.
Yeah, nutrition is not an emergency.
Nutrition is not an emergency, rather.
Yeah.
And so the fact that I feel like I'm hungry doesn't mean that my body actually needs food. And
what are your symptoms of hunger?
That's a good question. Well, I mean, before it was such a mixture because I just had this dogma that I needed to eat with a certain frequency. So I could have anything, even if it had a clear psychological component to it. Like I just felt craving or something, or the idea of a certain food is in my head. It would feel real, in part because I had the idea, I need to be eating frequently anyway, so maybe I didn't eat enough before, et cetera, et cetera. Versus when I have the idea, okay, I don't really need to be eating that frequently at all. And so then now I think of it as Yeah, what do I mean, I guess the feeling is usually I feel really hungry and it abides for a while. So if I'm drinking water or I do something else, it just for a while I'll feel I mean I'm it's I don't know a better term than feel hungry because it's not I don't think it's always my stomach rumbling, but it's that to the point of distraction. Whereas sometimes
Right.
it'll happen and then it'll be but it's different from craving. It's not that I have which I've certainly experienced, but that's more like I have this desire for a certain food or a certain sensation. And here's more like even if it's riced cauliflower that was plain, I would still want it because I feel unfull. So
Right. So
that's how I've
so
been operating.
so I didn't want to bias you, and I'm glad that I didn't. Okay, so most people would describe hunger as irritability, lack of focus, sometimes headache, sometimes shaky, sometimes the stomach kinds of sensations, grumbling stomach or just this feeling of emptiness in their stomach. It turns out 20 days into a 24-day fast, you feel none of that. In fact, if I ask you, how do you know you're thirsty? You could probably describe pretty accurately thirst. Now, I'm not talking about dehydrated, which is a very different thing. Just talking about thirsty. And when you're thirsty, yeah, your mouth gets dry. It's true. And, water is quenching when you drink it. It's the difference of living in if you're in Alabama in the humid and drinking water when it's hot out versus if you're the refreshing flavor it tastes when you're in Las Vegas in the desert. It's just so much more enjoyable to drink water in the desert than it is with 80 or 90% humidity. But my point here is that actually hunger isn't miserable. And so you actually are describing craving, even though you dismissed craving, you actually still describing that you're acting in craving. Now, craving can come from a number of reasons. One of them can be habituation, which I think is the strongest thing we have to break. And I think you were really getting into that in the last episode where you were talking a little bit about these patterns that you were breaking. But you have a lot of, every time you describe food, you describe it around situations. So you have a lot of ritual that's built into that. And I can tell you that 4 or 5 or 6 days into a fast, for the vast majority of people, there are some people that have horrible times, but 4 or 5 days in, you have an abundance of energy. In fact, your metabolism peaks goes up, rises for the first 4 days. And for me, by day 23 or 24, I was bounding upstairs because, you're now 25 pounds lighter in such a short period of time. And you're just, you just have all this energy. You feel like for just a minute, breatharians are real and that you'll never need to eat again. And it's so freeing in some ways because there's just time to do all these other things. And back to those habits, I want to circle back to that at some point if we get sidetracked. But with you and your productivity and habits, because we talked about that the last time, I believe one of the strongest narratives you could use to replace, okay, it's time to eat and it's time to break, and these cravings will be this increased productivity you can get if you focus that eating at a particular time. So one of the things that is now changed, and I want to really throw this back to you as a question, is as you were eating less frequently and you moved from what you were doing before to what you're doing now, what's something that really is easier today that you didn't think was possible, or not that it was impossible, but that you didn't think it was practical before? Is there anything that you really feel like you've moved yourself where you see, wow, this is something I really believed was a barrier?
Well, the thing I don't know if this qualifies, but what I mentioned about I didn't think I could go through. I think I thought I needed to eat right before bed, and I thought I often needed to eat to fall back to sleep if I woke up in the
Hmm.
middle of the night. So
That's right. I remember
that
you
was a
saying that.
big shift, and then it opened me up to other things because that really felt like me. Felt like, oh, this is just something about my physiology, and that's part of me. And maybe it's not a great idea to eat right before bed, but I need it. And then now that seems crazy.
Right. And it's true that we get sleepy after a meal. I mean, there's a good back to biological reason. There's a good reason, in biology, you eat a meal and you stay put because in the real world, calories are scarce. They're not abundant. So all of our coping mechanisms are set up around abundance. And now we find ourselves in a world of excess all the time.
You mean
And
the
there's
coping
just,
mechanisms are in a world of abundance or a world of scarcity?
I'm sorry, in a world of scarcity. Yeah, in a world of scarcity. I'm sorry if I said that wrong. So, but today we find ourselves in a world of abundance. So we evolved all these coping mechanisms in that scarcity world, and it's only in the last century that abundance, the number of overnourished and undernourished outnumber the undernourished worldwide, or that obesity is a symptom of poverty. I mean, think about that for just a second. That's kind of a crazy idea if you think about it. We're the only species that could probably, claim that. So most other organisms, except for the pets, we keep warm and overfed, and of course they get obese, they get heart disease, they get cancers, they get glucoregulatory issues, diabetes, so and autoimmune diseases. So our animals only know to eat because we habituate, we train them. I mean, we spent some time with your dog, and you saw some immediate responses when we engaged your dog's biological self. Is that true?
Yeah, although that's a whole other subject.
But no, it's exactly the same though. What I'm saying is that these biological coping mechanisms are there, and there are coping mechanisms for not making you miserable in a calorie scarce world, because otherwise how does a organism that needs to find food but doesn't have focus, is irritable, lethargy, all of those symptoms aren't coping mechanisms to find food. They sound like giving up coffee, giving up smoking, giving up alcohol. And while I'm not trying to draw this to an addiction to food, because I think that's a loaded, topic, what I am saying is that the withdrawal symptoms, when we are habitually ingesting something and we suddenly stop, that those symptoms are somewhat the same. And so what has to happen, if you want to give up smoking, but you feel like you have to, smoke after sex. So I'm only going to smoke after sex. Chances are you're going to slide right back into smoking, right? It requires that there is this period of time where your body is, your lizard brain is hitting on you and saying, I want to do this, and yet you're not giving in. And at some point, the switch flips, and it seems like some of those switches have already flipped for you. Is that true?
Yeah, so I'm wondering concretely. So I mean, one thing is, so right now I'm eating basically around 6:30 to 7:30 in the morning, and then 2:30 to 3:30 in the afternoon. And so one question is that, so we could talk about it. Okay, does that still have some addictive quality or withdrawal quality to it? But then there's the question of how much do I want to be eating, and would it be a lot better for once a day? Is there some ideal kind of frequencies? I'm trying to get at so I can see that if there's a better frequency, then it would be good to develop better coping mechanisms. So I'm interested in both. I'm interested in what your thoughts are on better frequency, but also, in any case, what are coping mechanisms, so that if I decided I want to fast for a couple of days, how I would go about that.
Right. Yes. So these are not mutually exclusive answers, but the first one is, obviously once or twice a day, and earlier is obviously, I think, better when it comes down to it. Some people can't do that as easily. In other words, what you're doing is actually more difficult for most people. Most people tend, before the bedtime, like you were saying, and I'm one of those people. Most people if they've got their meal behind them in the morning or the afternoon, early afternoon, then later they're likely to give in to food. Whereas if they wait longer, they think about it a little bit more for a few days, but then eating later is good because they just don't have to think about food again. So if you eat, 6 or 7 o'clock, not right before you go to bed, because I agree with you that this is not ideal. And, even though it helped you, I think it was maybe for the wrong reasons and probably not the best way to do it. However, generally speaking, being in the fed state, 4 to 8 hours meaning from the last bite, say 4 to 6 hours after that meal, you're in the fed state, because digestion doesn't just happen instantly. After you have that last swallow, it continues on. And you can see this if you're monitoring your blood glucose, or if you can think about the blood alcohol curve or something like that. So decrease. So I think you're okay there. But there's a second part of that question, which is, I believe you would like the flexibility and freedom to not have to stop if you were doing something else. In other words,
That's true.
for me, I know right now, if you said, hey, Ray, let's go, I can make it 24 days and I'll be just fine.
You can make it right now?
Right now, I just start drinking water at this very minute, and I frequently do this for 3 to 5 days, but I can drink water right now, and I wouldn't have to eat for the next month, and I'd be fine.
Okay, so, yeah, I did not feel like that.
I know you don't, and that's a scary thought for a lot of people, because they've really never experienced it, right? But what I'm saying is that there is a sense of power in that. Not that I do that. I don't think people need to regularly fast for that. I mean, I did it for research. I wouldn't do it, unless I had. Anyway, the answer is I wouldn't need to do that. I'm just saying, to me, there is a freedom of saying, not a really good choice in food right now, and I have something to do, so I'm just not going to eat right now. I like that flexibility, complete flexibility, and anyone can get there for 24 to 36 hours.
Okay, so how do we do it?
Well, you decrease that meal frequency like you're doing. And so I would say that I would start with that first meal. If you want to try it in the morning, you can do that, but you take that second meal and you start moving it closer and closer, and you know what's going to happen. You're just not hungry right now. And at some point you'll get down to one meal. And at that point, you're basically going 24 hours, right? One meal a day is 24-hour, about a 24-hour fast. It's really 4 to 6 hours after, so it's really only 20 hours. But you see what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
So you just slowly, you could either move breakfast later to meet the first meal later. Every first meal of the day is breaking fast, right? So they're all breakfasts, move that later, and just continue to move it later and later. And then your second meal of the day will get smaller and smaller. And at some point you should be fine, because that first meal really isn't impacting how you feel at night now that you've conquered the sleep thing. Do you feel pretty good about that at this point?
Yeah. So for
Eating late?
example, we started recording at 3:30 p.m. and I just finished my last meal, and I have no reservations. I'll probably go to bed. I go to bed pretty early, but 9:30, but I have no reservations about that. It's
Right.
very easy for me to avoid food.
So I would say, since you feel good with that, and you're not like raiding the pantry at 9 p.m. or something, since that feels good, what I would do is, and we can come back on this, but what I would do is start moving that first meal a day a little later until they end up in that one meal.
So that's what I fear. So one thing I really like about the current setup is that I'm not always hungry in the morning, but I like having the option of eating, because what I'm afraid of is I do my writing from, let's say, 7 to 11. And what I'm afraid of is having those withdrawal feelings during that, because then I just feel like, oh, this is going to be a big distraction and it's going to be painful. And then if I'm working...
But in 3 days, you're done. If you have those feelings, they'll go away in 3 days.
You think so?
Oh yeah, I know so. 3 to 4 days is the worst, is the worst part. And then after that, it's done.
So if I started eating at noon, I could develop that in a few days.
Absolutely. And I know you can do it. And what you're going to get on the backside of this, it's kind of like organizing things. What you're going to get back on side of this is complete flexibility of when you eat. So the goal here, and I know it sounds probably to some of the people listening like, what? This is the craziest idea. It's not that I can't eat all the time, but now that I don't have that fear because I've done it. For example, to a lot of people that are listening, getting up in front of an audience, a hostile audience, and speaking on the subjects you speak on would be a very fearful kind of thing. But the reason why, you will debate anyone is that you feel confident in what you're doing. You don't have to debate every single day to stay up on it. I'm not saying you don't have to, keep up with stuff, but you just, now that you can do it, it takes a lot of that pressure off. And that's what's going to happen here. There is an element of this, though, that is habituation, just like biting your nails or other kinds of habits that we have. And it takes some focus for those first 3 or 4 days. But what I believe it'll be useful, and that's why when I listened to your podcast, that was what I was pulling out, because I know how you like to be productive on that, in that sense. I really believe getting this flexibility and getting rid of the word fear associated with, because you're never in jeopardy of not having food. It's just, and you're not in jeopardy of starving, right? So once you get that element of fear out, I think it's going to create a really big power. Do you know what the longest medically supervised water fast is?
I think you told me 300 days or something.
Yeah, 382 days, right? So think about that for just a second. That's a long time without eating.
Yeah.
And, didn't have any big problems, So, with that, I think, just getting you to refocus and trying to think about this in another way, and then optimizing health span and optimizing eating and what you're eating is kind of a sort of a secondary part. I just really believe that once you're in control, you'll feel like a machine.
Mm-hmm.
And of course you can go back. There'll be times when socially you guys just want to have something to eat in the morning because you're at some event or whatever. There's nothing saying you can't.
Right.
It's just once you know that you don't have to, and it's not obligatory, and you're not responding to fear or habituation, then it's just a little uncomfortable. It's like, oh yeah, no big deal. I'm going to do my other thing now. So
Okay. So one more thing about that, and I want to get to any other points you have. How do I gauge how much to eat in that? Because, one thing I have fear about, I'm using that word deliberately, is, I'm not going to eat enough to make it to the next day. So sometime, and I've gotten pretty good at my current frequency of knowing there's just a certain level where I have, and also certain foods will work well. So I might have mentioned this on the show, but I find for me, cauliflower rice works really well in terms of when I eat that, I end up lasting a lot longer. Whereas I'm eating more dense stuff, it's dicey. Or even if I'm eating some dense stuff, adding like just having enough of that vegetable, I feel good. But I think 24 hours, I really got to stuff myself to the point of feeling sick, because otherwise I'm gonna run out.
right. So biology 101, what you're swallowing really has nothing to do with the energy that you have in the next 24 hours. In other words, all that food needs to actually make it to the tissue, which takes a while. And you really don't need to eat. The idea that what you're eating has anything to do with your energy levels is a myth. Now, that's not to say that someone can't, throw some, blood glucose.
Yeah, like
and
sugar
get a
high.
glucose. But that's not what happens. The people that are having highs and low have issues outside of that. And it has nothing to do with the idea that you're going to manage your body through swallowing. There's a lot of hubris in people talking this way, because your body 3 or 4 days into a fast is doing just fine, and none of those energy issues happen. And clearly, in terms of seeing the world as it is, and those contradictions don't exist, that person that lasted 382 days just taking a multivitamin and drinking water, that just couldn't happen. And by the way, he didn't lose all his muscle mass either. Lost 276 pounds of fat, averaged 0.7 pounds a day. Our clients average 0.6 to 0.8, but they don't fast. We don't do any fasting during weight loss. My point here is that this idea of decoupling swallowing from your energy or clarity, that is completely invented in your mind. I'm not saying you don't feel it, but it's just like someone who feels fear when they're trying to walk on a 2x4 on the ground. If it's sitting on the carpet, you can walk on the 2x4, right? But if now you're over 50 feet, it's the same 2x4,
Right.
but it's completely invented that it's any more difficult, right?
Right. So how does that affect how much I eat?
Well, there's the two words that are here. There's satiation and there's satiety. Satiation is the end of the desire to eat as you're eating the meal, right? So there's foods that can be very satiating. And then what you're also talking about is satiety, which is after you eat, how long does it take until that physical fullness stops and you then start to want to eat again? Using that physical fullness as an indicator is a really big issue. So as you eat less often, less frequently, you won't need to stuff your belly. So when you're talking about cauliflower rice, we call this vegetable stuffing in our lingo within our clients. Vegetable stuffing refers to the idea that these people that use really low calorie stuff so they can just really stuff themselves full. Penn Jillette, if you read Presto and go through how I helped him lose 100 pounds, he really had to deal with this really feeling full thing because it really meant a lot to him. And it also got him in trouble when his diet would slip off cue because he still needed that physical sensation. So you can stop that just by not eating as frequently. So for example, after a fast, you can imagine after 24 days of not eating, you kind of can't eat very much. You get a stomach ache. You get the opposite uncomfortable feeling. You feel uncomfortably full. 150 grams of watermelon, just a small little amount is fine, So that stuffed feeling is just habituation. And you can change that over time, but you just, it will naturally happen as you eat less frequently because you just you can only eat so much at one time. And then there's so much time for your stomach to retract before the next meal that eventually the volume starts coming down. So that'll just happen with time. But I can tell you right now, in terms of see the world as it is, the physical fullness or your eating really is not driving those sensations, feelings, and fears as much as the habituation of what you're doing. And that should, for a person like you, that should give you power. I'm saying biologically it's not an issue and that you can change it. And I think you just hearing that is probably all you'll need. And yes, it'll be uncomfortable for a day or two, but not more uncomfortable than when we're sitting down writing and we have a deadline and it's like, I got all these other things and I got to clear my head because I got to do this right now. I've got to get this done. And it's painful. It's painful, right? But once you get into that flow, and you start getting the one idea down, then you lose it and you get lost into it.
Got it. All right. Well, we don't have too much time left, but I want to make sure to hit some other points. So give me let's do some quick takes on, I know you had some other points, didn't you, that you wanted to share?
Well, I just wanted to follow you really on this and just make sure that I wanted to help you move this along and try to not allow you to turn your habits into this concept of fasting. I think the app and what everybody's doing now is putting the focus on the wrong thing. It's not how long you've been without food. It's just not having to worry about it at all. Watching an app to say it's time to eat, it's time to eat. This is more monkey training. I'm not saying it doesn't help people. I'm just saying I don't even think about food. People think I think about food all the time because I don't have to stop what I'm doing to eat ever. Ever. Not for a day, not for 2 days, not for 3 days. I just don't need to. When I do, I love to eat. And with a cookbook, I went to culinary school. I love to cook amazing food. So it's not that I don't enjoy it. It's just, it's not something I have to think about.
Okay. So the next instruction is to work toward once a day.
So move the early meal later until it meets the one that you had just now.
Okay. And so when I'm doing that, so let's say I wake up tomorrow morning because I ate pretty early today in the afternoon. I wake up tomorrow morning and I'm hungry. I mean, the only thing I know how to do so far is I just drink a bunch of water, and that usually makes it considerably better.
Because you're trying to use the stretch receptors on your stomach as an alleviation. So instead of drinking a lot of water, just grab some tea where you can, do you drink tea or coffee or anything like that?
A little bit.
So just grab something that you like to drink. If you want to just drink water, just have the water there and just, sip water as opposed to, I got to fill myself up. Right? So that you're not giving in to that feeling. And it'll feel uncomfortable for a couple of days, but it'll go away. Just like the other fear at late at night and stuff went away. And you now are sleeping so much better. And that's really great because not having a meal right before you sleep, because once we get into that 4 to 6 hours, and we'll get into this in another podcast, the amount of heat that your body is giving off, because you basically, back to the oxidative priority we touched on the last time, you have to, those calories that you can't store, you have to, waste, get rid of as waste heat. And so what ends up happening at night is your body needs a drop in temperature to go to sleep, and yet you're generating all this extra heat, and this becomes a real problem. This is, it goes off on a different subject we can deal with later with metabolic winter hypothesis. But the idea of moving it early, the fact that you feel good in the morning and the afternoon, this is great. This is fantastic. I would say 5% of the people that we deal with are that way. Almost everybody is the way I am, which is they'd rather just skip breakfast and go later in the day and eat later in the day. So you have a perfect situation because you can just move that early meal later. So just do it at 10 a.m. tomorrow or 11 a.m. And then eventually it's 1. And then finally it's just one meal. And you say, actually I can wait.
So it's moving the second meal later for now.
Yeah, just move it an hour, for a day or two, move it another hour, day or two, move it another hour. I mean, if you want to, ease into it, and you'll be fine. You'll have one meal a day. And once you're on one meal a day, the goal isn't just to eat one meal a day. The goal is to get comfortable with the idea that you don't have to respond to some physical sensation. So it doesn't become a fear, it becomes a scheduled choice. And I think that's what I see as a theme in everything, you talk about. What really drew me in on this podcast is these productivity and mindfulness exercises. And when I heard that fasting episode, 2 or 3 weeks ago, it doesn't fit at least the template I have of you as sort of a mentor, watching what you do and trying to learn from it. This seems like an issue where you're not really scheduling, it's scheduling you.
All right. Well, so I followed step 1 last time, so I'm gonna try it again, and it's
And then I think what we do
it
after
seems unlikely
that
that it'll work, but I mean it's the feeling of it. I mean I believe logically, so I'll act on it. But it just seems like, oh my God, once a day. I mean, how could I eat once a day?
Yeah, and what I think we should work for is we do that, and then we get to a certain point, and then we'll at some point we'll just do a weekend. We'll do let's just say a Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and then we'll call each other, and you'll eat for the first time, while we're talking, after not eating for a couple of days. It'd be fun. I think everybody would enjoy hearing and I have some fun things that you could do that would be really kind of fun with that. And if it's just 2 or 3 days, it's not a big issue.
Gotcha. All right. Well, I will experiment with this, and I'm not really a guinea pig because I know you've done it many, many times. But yeah, I definitely like the idea of being in control of it to the degree that you mentioned. So that's very, and I like the idea of just the freedom of. I mean, it's already so much better in terms of just having more energy during different parts of the day and not being super full for long periods of time. So that's nice, but it would be amazing just with my own schedule. Let's say I write from 7 to 11. It'd be amazing if I could eat at 11 every day or 12 every day.
Right. See?
Because then I would have the whole, because right now I eat at say 2:30, and then it affects my afternoon a little bit. And even in the morning, it affects my writing a little bit, although it feels better than currently not eating would feel.
Right. Yeah, and I can expect that that's true. Like I'm not. I actually believe, and I felt exactly what you're talking about. So one last little sort of anecdote. When Julianne and I were doing the Health Span Solution, we were preparing and making 3 to 4 recipes a day, or probably about a 6-week period. We had to come up with these 100 recipes, and we were eating a lot of that. And we both love to eat. It's great food. And we're just in the kitchen, just having a ball. Like, this is what we're doing. It's writing book, but it's a kind of a whole different experience that I've never had before in doing something like that. And she left after we finished that last session of stuff. And I started finding myself actually feeling this sensation that you're describing. I haven't felt it for 7 or 8 years. I forgot what it felt like. I mean, because even after all my fasts, I just don't feel that. And so for about 3 weeks, I was wrestling with that again, where I would need to actually make a meal or something midday, which was really crazy for me. And then I just powered down for 3 or 4 days, and now I'm back to how I always was. But it was really, I let it go for a while because I want to touch with my clients that I deal with, or people like you, that I can relate to it. And it had been so long since I felt like I need to eat right now. And so just to tell you that it is reversible as well. So it's not a hard, fast thing. We're very plastic when it comes to this. And I suspect, back to those metabolic winter, spring, summer, and fall, after metabolic winter, after you've depleted in that calorie scarce time of the year, you've depleted that energy. You use your energy storage organ, your fat. You don't use your organs. You don't use your muscle. You don't use your brain. Your body just actually uses fat. And then, during metabolic spring, summer, and fall, as food becomes more available, we naturally have more, our satiety decreases and we have more desire to eat. And so, it's not unreasonable to feel what we feel or what you're describing and what I've just described. So I want you to understand that's all perfectly normal. And, I tell everybody they're not broken. This is not broke. This is not that you're one way and everybody else the other way. This is just how you've habituated. And again, the key for you, from my perspective and knowing you and learning from you, is this idea of you having the decision to do this when you want it, that convenience. And I think once you get that squarely in your mind, that 3 or 4 or 5 days, whatever it takes, will pass pretty quickly and you'll have completely control. And I think that's the goal.
Gotcha. All right. Well, that is a great place to stop. And I really appreciate you coming on and giving me the latest degree of guidance. And I'm sure that some listeners who are following something like my path will follow this next step. And I think it'll be very educational. I expect it to work, even though, again, it has this feeling of, oh, well, that couldn't work. So I'm gonna start on this week, and I will keep you up to date. And we'll do if you want, we'll do another podcast once I reach the next threshold.
Perfect. Sounds good. Thanks a lot for having me on.
Thanks for being here. Thanks again to Ray Cronise. Proper pronunciation, Ray Cronise, once again. So hopefully he'll stop calling me Epstein. Anyway, thanks again to Ray Cronise for being on the show and sharing his wisdom. I'm actually recording this a couple days after the original interview, and so far so good in terms of delaying my early eating. I'm gradually delaying it, so I think I started at 10:30 a.m. today, and we will see how it goes. Hope you enjoyed today's episode. As always, if you have any questions, comments, love mail, or hate mail, you can email them to alex@alexepstein.com. No response promised, but I love reading them. To get regular updates about new shows, go to humanflourishingproject.com. To join the discussion on Facebook, go to facebook.com/humanflourishingproject. That's it for this week. I'll be back in another 2 weeks or less. Until then, I'm Alex Epstein. This has been the Human Flourishing Project.